Good morning. I'm Dan Hamilton, the Dean of the UNLV Boyd School of Law. It's a great pleasure to welcome you here today. On behalf of UNLV and the UNLV Boyd School of Law, it's a great honor to welcome the National Security Advisor to the United States, Ambassador Robert C. O'Brien. Ambassador O'Brien serves as the Senior Advisor to the President on International Affairs and chairs the National Security Council. Best of all, he is a lawyer, and it's a great privilege to welcome him to Nevada's Law School. I very much want to thank the friends of the Law School joining us today, including U.S. Attorney Nick Buchanan. Thank you, U.S. Attorney, for being here today. I see Judge Jay Biden. Thank you, Judge, for joining us. Former Attorney General Adam Laxalt. Thank you. And former State Senator and Chair of the Nevada Gaming Control Board, Becky Harris. Thank you, Becky. Also teaches at the Law School. And from the Nevada System of Higher Education, Regent Laura Perkins. So thank you all for being here today. We look forward to Ambassador O'Brien's talk. After his talk, he and I will engage in some Q&A. He's agreed to answer questions from people here, and please write any questions you might have on an index card. Any you already have, and have them, and give them to Nakia Jackson-Hale. We thank you for staying socially distanced and honoring the various protocols, including the mask protocol at UNLV. Ambassador O'Brien is a graduate of the University of California, Berkeley School of Law, served as a major in the Judge Advocate General Corps of the U.S. Army Reserve, and was for 7 years managing partner at Hammer Fox in California. He was a legal officer with the United States Compensation Commission in Geneva and served as the alternative representative for the United States to the United Nations. He then co-chaired the U.S. Department of State's Public-Private Partnership for Justice Reform in Afghanistan. Before becoming National Security Advisor, he served as the Special Presidential Envoy for Hostage Affairs, helping secure the release of hostages around the world. He is the author of the 2016 book, While America Slept, Restoring American Leadership to a World in Crisis. And we'll talk more about that book later on. As the state's law school, we aspire to bring together policymakers and leaders from the bench, bar, and public service. This is exemplified by days like today, bringing to the law school an administration official who plays a critical role in helping shape U.S. foreign policy around the world. This is a great service to the law school and our university, and we very much look forward to the discussion. Please join me in welcoming National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien.
Thank you, Dean Hamilton. What a pleasure it is to be here, and I feel I'm here with some friends with Adam, and great seeing you. He knows I worked for his grandfather, Senator Laxalt, when I was a young intern back in Washington in 1984, and that was a picture on my wall. And Judge Bybee, good to see you again. We have a number of close mutual friends, and Nick, surpassed your dad as a U.S. attorney here, and Nick's dad was the city attorney out in Los Angeles. We've got a lot of close friends. Regent Perkins, thank you for being here. And, so it's just a great group. I'm so used to doing things by Zoom now that even in a socially distanced environment, it's nice to get together with people and have some interaction. So I bring you greetings from the 45th President of the United States. I want to thank all of you on behalf of the President and the First Lady for the prayers and support that got out to him as he's battled the COVID crisis. Outpouring of support from the American people, but also from foreign leaders. And I know there's been a lot of that, a lot of prayers and good wishes coming from Nevada. So 4 years ago, President Trump was elected President of the United States. He had a very different view of our role in the world and how we should approach foreign policy and national security than some of his predecessors. And for those of us that know from prior administrations, like the judge or myself and others, at first we didn't quite know what America first meant. And what we learned is that the President always puts the American people, their safety, their rights, and their values first. He believes, like Ronald Reagan did, that the foundation for our national security policy is peace through strength. And over the past several years, the President's implemented that vision with alacrity and with purpose. The Trump administration sees the world as it is, not as we hope it to be. So we confront authoritarian regimes and totalitarian regimes, and we do not turn a blind eye to their malign behavior, merely hoping that they'll change. So the president has done the hard work, and it's sometimes been controversial work of strengthening our alliances and friendships so that we can stand with like-minded people against our adversaries. What we've decided is that the United States, and what the president's decided, is that the United States is no longer going to remain a party to treaties that are violated by the other signatories, and we will not remain a member of international organizations that are corrupt. The world has been demonstrably more peaceful and prosperous during the president's reign, especially prior to the COVID-19 pandemic that we're facing now. The ISIS physical caliphate, which was once the size of Great Britain, spanning Syria and Iraq, has been 100% destroyed. And we're working with our partners and allies and our brave soldiers, sailors, airmen, marines on the ground to root out the last of the ISIS cells. The leader of ISIS, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, who brought death to thousands and thousands of people in his caliphate, but also killed 4 young idealistic Americans, Foley, Soloff, Kasich, and Mueller, was brought to justice, and his reign of terror was ended. By the way, today, General Barr announced that 2 of the Beatles, 2 of the 4 killers from the UK that were involved in the beheadings of Peter Kasich and Sidney Soloff and Jim Foley, were transported back this morning to the United States. They'll see justice in the Eastern District of Virginia, and hopefully they'll spend the rest of their life in Supermax and pay for their crime. I had the privilege of talking to all the parents last night and this morning of those 4 Americans who were killed, and let them know that we haven't forgotten and we won't forget to bring justice the killers, and hopefully as part of this process we'll be able to derive information to find out what those remains are so we can bring them home finally. Over 50 American hostages and detainees held captive in 22 countries have been returned home. NAFTA has been replaced by the USMCA, which is a far better treaty and a far better arrangement for our farmers and our manufacturers. And we've worked with the leaders of El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, and Mexico to reduce undocumented migration by 85% in those countries. The president's maximum pressure campaign against Iran has paid off. We'll talk about the Abraham Accords in a minute, but it's also cut off Iranian funding for proxy wars in Yemen, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq. And the Iranians are still involved in all those places, but the largesse that they received as a result of JCPOA, over $150 million in sanctions relief, has now ended. Because of burden sharing among our allies, we now have additional commitments from non-US NATO allies of $400 billion in additional defense spending between now and 2024. And that additional defense spending will make the whole West safer against adversaries, whether they're jihadists, Russians, or Chinese. And after years of devastating defense sequestration under the prior administration, the president's budgets have had $2.5 trillion go to rebuilding our defenses over the past 3 years, and there's more to come. The president established the first new branch of the military in 75 years, the Space Force. And the Space Force has captured the imagination of our young officers and enlisted folks, especially in the Air Force, and they've been flocking to the Space Force to join. And space and cyber are going to be domains that are highly contested in the coming years, and this foresight's will pay off for many presidents down the line and for our country down the line. We've strengthened partnerships with our great populist democratic friends in Brazil and India, and those were partnerships that were not particularly strong up until President Trump taking office, but he's developed a great relationship with President Modi, Prime Minister Modi, and President Bolsonaro. I'll be going to Brazil to sign some new agreements with Brazil in the next week or two. And it's critical as we confront the rise of China, as we confront our revenge against Russia, that we maintain strong relations with the great democracies of the world. In the Indo-Pacific, we've dramatically expanded cooperation with our treaty allies, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, Thailand, the Philippines. And we're working with them on everything from counter-terrorism to maritime interdiction of drugs and narcotics to freedom of navigation, whether it's in the Taiwan Straits, the South China Sea, or the East China Sea. In Afghanistan, we signed a peace agreement with the Taliban, and after 19 years of war, American troops are coming home. And when the president took office, there were over 10,000 American troops in Afghanistan. As of today, there are under 5,000, and that will go to 2,500 by early next year. Ultimately, let me just say one quick personal note on that issue. Probably the toughest job I've had. I had some tough jobs in the hostage. In my hostage position, where we lost hostages and had to tell families, but the toughest thing I've had to do in government is to go to Dover Air Force Base with the president, or if the president was unavailable, to go and represent the president as we had to dignify transfer the remains of U.S. servicemen and women coming back to the U.S. and do your best to comfort the family and pay respects to the fallen heroes there. Since we signed this agreement, I think it was February 28th or 29th of this year, we have not had one death in combat of American servicemen or women in Afghanistan. So unfortunately, we still have training accidents. We still lose people. It's a dangerous job defending this country. We haven't had to go to Dover to bring home one of our fallen heroes, and that's made a big difference. Ultimately, the Afghans themselves are going to have to work out an accord, a peace agreement. Those negotiations have started in Doha. They've been going on now for several weeks. It's going to be slow progress. It's going to be hard progress, but we think it's a necessary step, and we think Americans need to come home. Earlier this month, President Trump achieved a truly historic peace agreement between the United Arab Emirates, the Kingdom of Bahrain, and the State of Israel. We call it the Abraham Accords in English. Our Arab friends call it the Abraham Accords, and our Jewish friends call it the Abraham Accord, or the Abraham Accord. It's the first significant Middle East peace advance in 26 years. And I was fortunate enough to be on the first historic flight, on an El Al flight that left Ben Gurion Airport and flew to Abu Dhabi International Airport. And we were there with the Israeli delegation. And it was quite something as we crossed into Saudi airspace, and the pilots announced that we were cleared to enter Saudi airspace on an Israeli El Al jet, an Israeli jet, and the folks who were with were removed. And then it became even more special as we landed in Abu Dhabi, and they truly had the red carpet treatment for everyone in the Gulf. No one knows how to lay on the red carpet like the Gulf Arabs do. And they had a red carpet reception, not so much for us, but for their Israeli counterparts. And I think our Israeli friends felt like they were almost being welcomed back into the family after many, many years, after 70 years since the founding of Israel. It was quite something. Nations in the Middle East are putting aside old grievances and embracing a better future based on shared interests and shared goals. And the President has put the Middle East on a transformative path. And I can tell you, we will have other, especially if we get some more time in office, we're going to have other countries join the Abraham Accords. They're in discussions, and they're not easy discussions. It's tough negotiations. I know there's some great negotiators in this room, but I'm not sure there's any better negotiators than the folks in that region of the world. We're in some tough negotiations, but we're going to have a number of other countries join the Abraham Accords. We made important progress just a few weeks ago in another area where we had an intractable conflict between Serbia and Kosovo. And we were able to convince the Prime Minister of Kosovo and the President of Serbia, President Vučić, and Prime Minister Hoti, who brought them to the White House, and we were able to convince them to normalize their economic relations. And again, that was a culmination of many months and almost a year of negotiation with the parties, and a major step forward. So President Trump has ended the era of leading from behind, strategic patience. And I don't think there's any question around the world that we're leading as the preeminent free world power, and we're bringing our values to bear and protecting our values. We're putting together a new international consensus on China. The president was the first major leader to recognize that the old conventional wisdom, that it was only a matter of time before the Chinese would liberalize, democratize, and become more like us, was wrong. And instead, China has become more totalitarian, more mercantilist, more nationalist, and more committed than ever to Marxism-Leninism. Under this administration, we're increasingly standing up to China. We refuse to accept the status quo, and instead the president imposed significant tariffs on the Chinese to fight their unlawful trade practices and their theft of our intellectual property. And that did bring the Chinese to the table for the phase 1 trade deal, which would have resulted or should result in a $200 billion reduction in trade deficit with China. Unfortunately, the COVID virus has overtaken that achievement, and in some ways, given the amount of money that we're spending on COVID relief, it has been OBE. But one of the Chinese negotiators said the following to the Wall Street Journal: "I guess we can't bluff anymore with the United States." And I think they realized that President Trump, when he came to negotiate, meant business. So diverse challenges to our security remain, from Russia to Iran to North Korea to Venezuela, extremist terrorists and organizations and transnational criminal organizations. But under our leadership, we're standing with our allies, and we're rising to the occasion to face these challenges, and the results of the President's policies speak for themselves. So with that, I'll open myself up to some questions. I'll come join the Dean here, but thank you again for welcoming me to this great law school. I always feel more comfortable in a classroom setting like this or in a courtroom than I do necessarily out doing our diplomatic negotiations. I love being around the law students and law faculty and our judges and lawyers. And as I tell people, I look forward to everyone says, "What are you going to do when you're done with this?" And I said, "I can always go chase ambulances back in LA if everything else goes wrong." But I look forward to rejoining you in my lifelong profession and not too distant future. So thank you again very much for the kind welcome. I'm good.
Thank you so much, Mr. Ambassador, for those opening and very thoughtful remarks. We've got a number of questions from the audience that I think we'll start off with. Many of them are about China, which won't surprise you. So let me just start with a big picture question. Do you think a bipolar hegemony with China is inevitable? Do you think the US and China can coexist peacefully as the two major powers in the world?
Yeah, so this has been something the Chinese have been pushing for some time. They want to have a P2 instead of a P5. I don't think we're going to have a bipolar situation in the world right now. I think we're slowly entering into a multipolar situation. I think ultimately the Chinese would like to have a unipolar situation where every other country is some sort of tributary to China. I mean, that was how they viewed the world for thousands of years. I think that's how they view it today with the Marxist-Leninist tint to it. But look, I think we're standing up to the Chinese. Our allies are following us, whether it's Huawei and even Germany now coming on board with Huawei on 5G to prefer trusted providers. So I think you're going to have a situation. I think it's possible that China has overplayed their hand with how they've responded to COVID. I think they've overplayed their hand with their data theft and their IP theft. And I think countries around the world are starting to realize what we're up against with China. And I think you could eventually have a more isolated China when you have the great democracies of Brazil and India, the European Union, the UK. We even have countries in Africa that are considered close friends of China who've literally called us up and asked us if we would pay off their debt to China. And said if we do that, then they'll never do anything further with China. Now, that's not the president's inclination, and we want to be a little more parsimonious with the taxpayers' money. But I think there's a global consensus that's developing on China's malign behavior, and so I'm not sure you'll have a bipolar or I'm pretty certain you want to have a unipolar world where the Chinese run everything which they like, as long as we stay strong. I don't think you'll have a bipolar situation where we split the world between us and China. But I do think you're going to have more of a multipolar world where there are various centers of power. Russia, Europe, I think Africa with its young population has tremendous opportunity. So I think you're going to see a more fluid international system than we have in the past.
Another question on China. What are the prospects for democracy in Hong Kong long term?
Zero. It's very sad. So the Chinese entered into an agreement with the British in 1984 called the Joint Sino-British Declaration. It was lodged with the UN as an official treaty. It promised one country, two systems through 2047. We're now in 2020, and the Chinese passed a national security law, which is vague, ambiguous, and gives them the opportunity to do whatever they would like with Hong Kong, define any sort of conduct as threatening national security, and they've been using it extensively. So I think that we now have one country, one system, and there's going to be very little difference going forward between Hong Kong and Shanghai or Beijing or any of the other cities in China. And I think it's a very sad thing for the people of Hong Kong and hope for democracy for many more years to come, hoping that the Chinese would liberalize and become more democratic, become more like their system would become more like Hong Kong, as opposed to Hong Kong being absorbed into communist China.
Related question, what are the United States' options when China determines that it's in their interest to absorb Taiwan in some fashion into the larger state, if that comes to pass?
Well, look, as the situation stands right now, Taiwan is prepared to fight for its freedom, and so China has become very strong militarily. They've built up a massive navy. They've had a navy building program that probably hasn't been seen in the world since the Kaiser built the Kriegsmarine back prior to World War I, when he tried to displace or at least match the British on the high seas. The Chinese have engaged in a similar naval buildup. Part of that is to give them the ability to push us back out of the Western Pacific and allow them to engage in amphibious landing in Taiwan. The problem with that is that amphibious landings are notoriously difficult. It was only a 12-mile stretch between the English Channel and between England and France across the English Channel that kept Napoleon out and kept Hitler out. And so we've got over 100 miles between Taiwan and China. There are very few landing beaches in Taiwan. So it's not an easy task, and there's also a lot of ambiguity about what the United States would do in response to an attack by China on Taiwan. Now, the advice that we've given our Taiwanese friends is the same advice we've given our European friends, and that is you can't just spend 1% of your GDP, which the Taiwanese have been doing, 1.2% of your GDP on defense, and hope to deter China, which is engaged in the most massive military buildup in 70 years. And so the Taiwanese need to undertake the efforts to rebuild their military and to make them ultimately turn themselves into a porcupine. As lions generally don't like to eat porcupines, and so Taiwan needs to become a porcupine, and we've given them some suggestions on how they can do that. And ultimately, I think that would deter a Chinese invasion of Taiwan.
Thank you. We have two questions about China and the coronavirus. One is there an appetite with the international community to influence or coerce transparency in the investigation of the Wuhan lab? Can the United Nations Security Council be involved? And a related question, that different virologists from inside China have stated there's some proof that the COVID-19 virus could not have been a product of nature and was created in a laboratory. Does the administration have a view on that assertion? And what are your conclusions about either of those assertions?
So thanks. On the issue of an investigation and transparency, it's something we've called for. It's something Australia has called for. The Chinese have not been forthcoming. They early on in the crisis, you may recall, they jailed about 500 Chinese citizens who spoke out against the party or spoke out against the cover-up of the COVID pandemic within China. They never shared the virus with us, the early forms of the virus with us. So there's been an utter lack of transparency on the Chinese part. Now, the issue of compelling the Chinese to cooperate with an investigation, it's a difficult question because you've got, certainly the Security Council can't do it because the Chinese have one of the P5 members has a veto on the Security Council, so you wouldn't be able to get that through in a resolution. And, as far as coming up with a coalition of the willing type of countries that would sanction China or put enough pressure on China, that's very difficult to do. Look, there's been a lot of talk about reparations as well, about the Chinese paying reparations to the rest of the world for the virus. And there are some countries that are interested in pursuing reparations. I think there are going to be some civil lawsuits that are filed here in the U.S. And never underestimate well-funded American trial lawyers the havoc that they can wreak. So there are some issues of whether sovereign immunity will apply in this case. So, we'll have to wait and see how all this develops. So far, the Chinese haven't shown any appetite to cooperate from the very start of the pandemic until now on an investigation. As far as how the virus was created, that's something we've got a lot of smart scientists looking at, both in and out of government. There are reports that this was created in a lab and escaped accidentally through bad lab hygiene practices. The Chinese were pushing at the start that this came out of a wet market. My concern with that is neither one of those things is a good answer, right? It's like, well, no, it didn't come out of our lab, it came out of our wet market where we slaughter exotic animals and consume them on site raw. Or it came out of the lab. Either one is a loser for China. And we've had a situation from the turn of the century that we've had SARS. Just in the last 20 years, we have SARS, we've had H1N1, we've had swine flu, we've had avian flu, and now we've had COVID coming out of China. So there's no question that China is in a public health crisis. So whether this stuff's coming from their labs or their wet markets, the international community has to put pressure on China to make sure this doesn't happen again. We can't afford another SARS. We can't afford another COVID. We've got over 1 million people killed around the world because of this. We've had trillions of dollars in economic loss as a result of this behavior. So China does have to curb its behavior. At some point, the rest of the world is going to be so fed up with China. If China doesn't get this sort of thing under control, then I think you could have a situation where China gets cut off because countries just can't afford the risk of dealing with it.
Thank you. We've got one more China question. China has provided hundreds of millions of dollars in infrastructure loans to various countries around the world. Your opening remarks indicate there may be some buyer's remorse. Is China able to influence these countries in significant ways as a result of these loans and further isolate the United States from those countries?
Yeah, so primarily that question is referring to China's One Belt, One Road initiative, which is what they call their major foreign aid project to project Chinese influence around the world from Europe all through Asia, through Africa, even Latin America. The problem with One Belt, One Road is that the Chinese will go in and bid or offer loans to countries. Oftentimes those loans, because the Chinese don't have best practices, they don't have FCPA, they're not concerned about where the money ends up. A lot of that money gets skimmed off by corrupt leaders in the countries that are receiving the loans. So part of the money's gone. The next thing that happens with those loans, they usually go to Chinese contractors who then hire Chinese workers and bring them into the countries from China. So you're getting no local workers who are being trained with the skills, or you're not really helping the local economy. All the money is staying in China, same with Chinese construction companies, Chinese workers, and then they leave. Many of the projects are white elephants, and they're stadiums or facilities that the country doesn't really need, but big ticket infrastructure projects. At the end of the day, the country's then saddled with a massive debt, often with usurious interest rates. So this isn't like US aid or traditional Western aid where you go in and give a poor country a helping hand and either forgive the loan at some point or it's just straight development aid. These loans come with strings attached. So and they usually have collateral attached to them. So if the country stops paying the loan, China can then execute on the collateral. And we saw this happen in Sri Lanka, where China took over the major port in Sri Lanka on a 99-year lease because Sri Lanka couldn't repay the OBAR, the One Belt, One Road loan. So we're having lots of countries come to us. I think I like the way that they handled the pandemic and tried to premise the provision of PPE or ventilators on some sort of concession from the country that was going to receive the aid. There was a real backlash to that. I think we're starting to see a real backlash with these Chinese loans and One Belt, One Road. So rather than isolate us, I think it's ultimately going to hurt China.
Thank you. We've got a number of questions about Iran. Will not surprise you. Was there a failure in 2009 to support the Green Revolution in Iran on behalf of the United States? And are moderate leaders from the 2009 Green Revolution still alive that are potential partners?
Yeah, it's really hard to say. I mean, one of the things that we have not pushed in the administration for most countries is regime change. I think that the president's taken the position that nation building, regime change, some of those things that we were very excited about. We're very heady in the early 2000s, late 90s, early 2000s. I think we've tried to be more modest in our foreign policy. And obviously, it was not a great idea to side with the Mullahs against the folks in the Green Rooms, the demonstrations. I'm not sure if it was a revolution, but it would have been nice to support, at least with words, the folks that were fighting for democracy in 2009. I think that was a mistake. I think that the idea was that if we appeased the mullahs and appeased Tehran, somehow they would lessen their antipathy to the United States. That's never going to happen because hating the United States is the very center of the Iranian Revolution. So I think it was I think that was probably a mistake. As far as the leaders, it's very difficult to survive in a totalitarian country like Iran. I mean, you see people hanging from cranes all the time, and they've got a very, very efficient police state. They've got not only the legitimate government, or what you might call legitimate government, and their intelligence apparatus, but you also have the whole parallel government of Iran with the Iranian Revolutionary Guard and the past Iran. And so, you don't give people much of a chance to last very long as a dissident in a country like Iran. You end up in heaven jail or hanging from a crane. So I don't know how many of the folks that are left from 2009 that would be willing to go out and protest, but it takes a pretty brave and courageous person to protest in a place like Iran.
It's a question that combines Iran and China. What, to your mind, are the most effective use of economic sanctions as a tool of foreign policy, and how would you assess the use of sanctions in Iran and China?
So with Iran, the sanctions have worked incredibly well. The Iranian economy has been devastated. I think if the president is reelected, Iran will come to the table and we'll get a deal on the nuclear program with dispatch. But you've got to be very careful using sanctions. Sanctions are a very powerful tool. The reason they work is because we're the reserve currency of the world, and we have a lot of tools as a reserve currency to impose sanctions and to impose secondary sanctions to keep other countries from dealing with a bad actor. The problem is if that becomes the only tool in your toolkit, and sanctions are usually better than going to war or armed conflict. But the sanctions themselves can take many years to work and many years to have the impact. And what we've seen with Maduro, and what we've seen with the mullahs, and what we see with the DPRK that has been hit very hard with sanctions, North Korea, is they have a resilience to them. If they're willing to kill their own people, if they have enough money, enough resources to keep the military and the secret police paid, it takes a long time for the sanctions to have the effect that we need to really cripple the regime. So, it takes some time. The other thing that we have to worry about is if we have too many sanctions regimes going at the same time, at some point it becomes, it could become a threat to the dollar being the reserve currency. So, the sanctions can be very valuable to use in a very selective, strategic fashion. But what concerns me, and I know it concerns Treasury Secretary Mnuchin, is that sometimes we have too many sanctions regimes on too many countries at the same time, and that you could lose the impact and the power of the sanctions if you overuse the tool. And so we just need to be careful that we don't do that.
We have a couple of questions about Russia. We see lots of media reports about past and present Russian disinformation campaigns and election meddling. How significant are these threats?
Yeah, so look, this is not something new. I mean, the Russians have been doing disinformation for long before I was born. I mean, this has been something that has been a Russian ploy in the West and with the U.S. Since the very foundation of the revolution and the Bolshevik Revolution. So, look, it's something they're up to. I don't think that their influence operations, frankly, are that effective. I mean, having a bunch of trolls in St. Petersburg going on Twitter saying, Democrats hate guns. We'll take guns if vote Democrat. No vote for Biden. I mean, the stuff's pretty. It's not very sophisticated. What was sophisticated was the way that they used the Steele report and ultimately created 3 years of investigations. The president working with an opposition campaign and creating havoc and division in the country. That was very effective. Russian espionage operation. How effective their Facebook ads and their Twitter ads are, it's hard to say. There's billions of dollars that are being poured into the presidential campaign on both sides. So, what a Russian troll farm can do in St. Petersburg to influence Americans to vote one way or the other, I don't know. What I can tell you is that a much more sophisticated influence operation involving much more money and that's influence operation that's much more pervasive is the Chinese Communist Party's attempt to influence our politics from the university level, the Confucius Institutes, to influencing local mayors and through sister city programs and governors. Their information gathering on American politicians, including senior officials in the administration, but also on members of Congress. Their ability to spend vast sums of money in the U.S. I mean, as Attorney General Barr said, and I agree with him 100%, is that the Chinese influence operations are a level of magnitude higher than Russian influence in our election. And as far as my biggest concern, whether it's Russia or China or Iran, and by the way, Microsoft just came out a report, so it's not even a U.S. government report, this is a Microsoft report that identified those three countries as leading influencers or meddlers in a U.S. election. What concerns me the most is something that happens on election day. So if you had hackers hack into the Secretary of State website and change vote totals or tallies, not that they could change the actual tallies that were coming in, they could be audited from the machines, from the tape, and from the physical ballots, but you just hacked onto the Iowa Secretary of State website, and you can imagine them saying, Donald Trump has won Iowa by 50,000 votes. The next morning, the Iowa Secretary of State says that someone hacked us. Vice President Biden won by 10,000 votes. Or reverse it, Wisconsin, Biden won, but then the Secretary of State said, no, Trump actually won by 5,000 votes. Who's going to believe that in this polarized environment that we're in right now? So the incentive for mischief on election day infrastructure for any of our adversaries, whether it's China or Russia or Iran or there are several other countries that would like to play in the space but may not have the capability, but we've seen them trying. The incentive is very high, especially given the way the country's polarized right now. And that's what concerns me the most about election interference. Isn't so much the attempts to go on Twitter and convince people to vote one way or the other. It's what would happen to our election day infrastructure. And so that's why we spend hundreds of millions of dollars working very closely with the secretaries of state across the 50 states and the U.S. territories. Some cases lieutenant governors, but the senior election officials in each state to make sure that our election infrastructure is as hardened as possible to avoid interference with the elections on election day or around election day, because that's something that causes me really great concern.
What are the greatest challenges in the U.S.-Russia relationship?
Well, they're Russians. I mean, that's the greatest challenge. You look at Russian history; it's not like it's ever been that great. Russia's an empire, and Vladimir Putin said that the biggest geopolitical catastrophe of his lifetime was the fall of the Soviet Union. The Russians want space around their empire. They want to influence the near abroad and influence in a way where the influence really means control the near abroad, so whether it's the Baltics or Poland or Romania or Bulgaria, the frontline states. So look, we just kind of bump into the Russians geopolitically because we're allied with Europe. And so that's kind of the fundamental problem. We each have about 1,500 nuclear weapons, long-range nuclear weapons pointed at each other. So, that's an issue that we have to deal with. The Russians have a very different system of government than we do. It's not Soviet Russia, it's not communism, but you have an authoritarian ruler in Russia, and their values are different than our values. So we have some fundamental, very, very fundamental differences. Having said that, there are areas that we can work together with the Russians. I was in Geneva meeting with my counterpart, Nikolai Patrushev, on Friday, and one thing that we would like to get done is we'd like to get a new arms control deal that reduces, that builds on New START, but maybe a better deal for the United States than New START, which only affected long-range nuclear delivery systems, but didn't address the vast disparity in nuclear weapon warheads that can be deployed tactically or regionally by the Russians. And so we want to get a better deal and want to see if we can reduce the number of nuclear warheads that are pointed at themselves or that were pointed at the Russians, and hopefully make the world a little bit safer. And so, that's an area where we work together with President Putin and President Trump have both committed to working together to freezing the number of warheads being produced and that sort of thing. Counter-terrorism is an area where we can work together. We've advised the Russians of several plots against them that we've uncovered and that have saved many lives in Russia. So I think we could work together on counter-terrorism, but even there you have some difficulties because they're in Syria. They let us fight ISIS, but then their troops there don't fight ISIS themselves. They let us do it, and they spend their time fighting regime opponents. Cyber is an area where we could potentially cooperate. So there are areas. We've got a conflict that's going on in Azerbaijan and Armenia right now. That's an area where I want to say we're on the same side, but we're co-chairing the Minsk group, trying to bring peace to the region of the Caucasus, and some of our interests are aligned with the Russians in that conflict. So there are areas that we can work together, and we should work together in those areas and cooperate where we can. But there are also there's just some fundamental differences and chasms which are necessarily be difficult to bridge.
Thank you. Should the United States continue to withdraw troops from different nations around the world? As someone who has spent significant time in Afghanistan, what are the risks of withdrawing troops from there?
Yeah, so the president's made it very clear. He ran on one of his key campaign promises was to end the endless wars, and it's always a delicate balancing act. So I spent 4 years of my life at the end of the Bush administration, into the Obama administration, working on justice reform in Afghanistan. I've spent time in Afghanistan. I have friends there. We've trained judges and defense lawyers and prosecutors in Afghanistan, a lot of them women, and they've got a difficult situation because they have a large insurgency there that is durable and is ethnically based for the most part among Pashtuns and the Taliban. But ultimately, the Afghans are going to have to work out an accord, an arrangement that allows the Afghan people to live together. I don't think we can continue to send young Americans. We can't spend the money, the $3 billion a month that we're spending, while the Chinese spend that same amount of money to launch 2 new frigates every month. And we can't spend the best of American youth in Afghanistan trying to work out a situation that's been going on for thousands of years in those tribal wars. The same thing in Iraq. And so we need to get our folks home from these wars. Syria is another one. At the same time, we have to do it in a way that doesn't allow Afghanistan or Iraq or Syria, for that matter, to become a safe haven for terrorists, whether it's ISIS or Al-Qaeda or JNM in the Sahel or AQAP in Yemen, to have a home base from which they can plot attacks against the United States and carry out another 9/11. So it's a delicate balance, but we have to figure out how we can protect the country, probably with some more offshore use of our forces and strikes into these countries when it's necessary to deter them or to break up plots or to remove enemy combatants from the battlefield. So we've got to figure out a way to do that is not as costly as Iraq and Afghanistan have been over the past almost 20 years now.
Thank you. Let's turn to the Middle East. There was recently a peace treaty signed at the White House. What are the possibilities for more peace treaties in the Middle East?
I think the possibilities are high. We're in talks now with a number of Arab countries joining the Abraham Accords. I think there's a real hunger among the youth and young people in these Arab countries. They're watching what's happening in Israel. They're seeing Israel the startup nation. They're seeing creativity and innovation that's taking place in Israel. They'd like to have a part of that kind of an economy. And so I think there's a real hunger for these, for additional countries to join the Accords. Having said that, this is the toughest, as I mentioned before, this is the toughest place in the world to negotiate. And everybody wants something in return for their normalization of relations with Israel. But I think we're going to see some real progress there, and in the next several months. I think there are at least 3 or 4 additional countries that will join the Abraham Accords, and I think that's going to be a game changer for the Middle East.
How will it be a game changer?
Well, you're going to have commerce and tourism and commerce and financial interaction between the Arab countries and Israel. Israel's technology, whether it comes to high tech or water conservation or agriculture, moving into the Arab countries, you're going to see in a number of the, especially the Gulf Arab countries, there are massive sovereign wealth funds invested in Israel, and I think you're going to have just tremendous opportunities for commerce and interaction between the countries that will break down barriers. I think that the piece that we're working on, that we're trying to effectuate, is going to be very different than what I call the cold pieces of the Israeli-Egyptian or the Israeli-Jordanian peace deals, which were on the borders and which were somewhat of a cold peace, have been a cold peace. I think the potential for interaction between Israel and these other countries would be quite great.
Another question from the audience here today. As you mentioned, DOJ announced charges against two Bastis earlier today. Could you discuss how President Trump's Middle East strategy helped make this announcement possible?
Is this I don't know, is it the Beatles today?
I'm having trouble reading the handwriting.
The Coach Al Sheikh that we were talking about, General Barr's conference this morning. Yeah, so I'm sure I raised that question, but I think it's look, one of the way that came about is, number one, in our counter-ISIS campaign, we helped our Kurdish friends round up a lot of these ISIS terrorists. And originally, it was the Kurds who got a hold, the Kurds in Syria who got a hold of the 4 Beatles. And for those of you who don't know the Beatles, they were named the Beatles because they were 4 jihadis from the UK, spoke with in British English, and they were primarily responsible for the beheadings of Salaf, Kasich, and Foley, and the death of Caleb Mueller. So the Kurds rounded them up. When the Turks moved into northern Syria to create a buffer zone, one of the things that we wanted to make sure is that those, specifically these 2 Beatles who were still alive and in Kurdish custody, we wanted to make sure that they did not somehow get released or fall into Turkish hands or other hands. So we had our special forces, as we call upon them to do for various difficult tasks. I had a relatively daring raid into an area that was becoming surrounded by the Turks, but into a Kurdish detention camp, working with the Kurds who are our allies, picked up the Beatles, moved them to Iraq. We had a hard time bringing them here because the British controlled most of the evidence against them to prosecute them for murder. The Brits were prepared to provide the evidence to us, but the families of the Beatles sued, saying that because Britain doesn't have the UK doesn't have a death penalty, if the evidence was provided to us, we could use the evidence to seek the death, to obtain a conviction and seek the death penalty against the Beatles. That was tied up in proceedings for many years in the UK, and ultimately General Barr decided, and in conversations with the families that a number of us had, that it was more important to get them back here and prosecute them and seek life sentences, put them in federal supermax if we can obtain a conviction, than to hold out for the evidence and keep the death penalty option open. So we made a commitment to the UK that in return for the evidence, we would drop our request for the death penalty and seek life imprisonment. And so I think it was really good work by the DOJ, very good work by the State Department, those who were involved in the negotiations on the UK side. Great work by special forces who ultimately helped the Kurds get them in the first place and then brought them to American custody recently when there was a concern that they might not be held or continue to be held, and now it'll be up to our prosecutors, the U.S. Attorney in the Eastern District of Virginia, and the judges in the case and the jury to make sure they get a fair trial, and hopefully they'll be convicted and they'll go to Colorado for a long time.
Thank you. We are almost running out of time, so I wonder if we could do a lightning round of various issues. What are the best short-term and medium-term prospects for international cooperation on addressing climate change?
I think the best thing we can do is continue to innovate. I think addressing climate change through treaties, which allows the polluting nations, India, China, to pollute until 2050, but we'll continue to reduce our emissions. I don't think there's much future there. I think the real future is coming up with American technologies that reduce our emissions. Our emissions are lower now than they would have been under the Paris Climate Accords, and we're doing that not because the government is opposing it, it's because the private sector is using their creativity and their imagination and their ingenuity to develop products that are cleaner. I think we also need to bring a lot of pressure on the polluters. The idea that China continues to build coal-fired electric plants is unbelievable. The idea that, and it's not just climate change, it's the garbage. I mean, the amount of garbage that the Chinese are dumping into the Pacific Ocean is astronomical. I mean, we have like a floating island in the Pacific because the Chinese dump all their garbage in the Pacific. I mean, we got to stop that. So that's not a U.S. thing. That's not a Paris Climate Accord thing. That's something that the nations of the world need to get together and shame China into changing its behavior. The pollution is just rampant. What the president's talking about is he wants clean air and clean water. That's a great place to start. And we've got to continue to innovate. We've got to continue to bring our carbon emissions down as we can in an area that we control, which is the United States. And then we've got to put pressure on the polluting nations, Brazil, India, China, as these large countries emerge, to switch over to sources of energy that are either renewable or use at a minimum use LNG and other forms of gas that are lighter, that have a lighter impact on the environment.
Thank you. How has the coronavirus changed international relations? Has it increased or decreased the prospects for international cooperation?
I think in some ways it's increased cooperation. I mean, to see what happened as the virus started to flare up around the world and see the cooperation of countries in trying to fight the virus, it's been impressive. There's been a lot of cooperation, especially with our allies on on vaccines, on therapeutics, we've given out 16,000 ventilators to countries around the world that needed ventilators, including some of the Pacific Islands that didn't have any ventilators whatsoever. So I think there's been tremendous cooperation there, and I think we're going to need more cooperation on the economic side. The U.S. is coming out of the virus in a bit of a V-shaped recovery. It's looking pretty good for us, although we still have 10 million people unemployed that weren't unemployed before this got launched on us by China. But we've got to help our colleagues around the world. I spent some time with President Duque and President Cortizo in Colombia and Panama, respectively, last month. And one of the things we're doing, we have an American growth initiative there. And we're investing in their infrastructure and their energy projects to help those countries as they come out of the virus do so in a manner that allows their people to have good jobs and their economies to improve. So we're going to get a lot of cooperation on the economic front coming out of COVID. So look, I think generally, it's been a terrible thing, but to the extent there is some silver lining, I think there's going to be a greater willingness to work together on issues of health and on economic recovery issues. The problem is, again, I hate to keep going back to this, I like a broken record. The Chinese aren't interested in that. So they didn't want reforms in WHO. They don't want to change things. It's been working pretty well for them the past 10 or 12 years where we've let them have to run a show, but we're going to, I think, again, there's going to be an international consensus that doesn't embrace the Chinese model, but that embraces more of a Western cooperative model in international relations.
I'm curious about your role as Special Presidential Envoy for Hostage Affairs. What did that role entail, and what's the state of hostages from the United States being held around the world?
So the number is drastically reduced. The president started this before I became the special envoy. And, President Trump and Secretary Pompeo were quite effective in bringing folks home. And in fact, the weekend before I took my job, Mike Pompeo flew to North Korea and brought 3 North Korean detainees, hostages, home. And I was starting that Monday, and he sent me a text. It was like 3-0. He's up on me. And so They informed me when I got there, since I worked for him, that he got credit for everybody around home, so I couldn't catch up. Look, the president really made it a top priority to bring our detainees home and our hostages home. I think he's brought 50 home from 22 different countries. What I did is I got a spreadsheet when I took the job 3 years ago, almost 3 years ago. And they handed me the spreadsheet, and I didn't like the spreadsheet, Dean, because it had the person's name, when they were taken, and what country they were in, and how long they'd been in, various things kind of across the dashboard. It was an Excel spreadsheet. And so I had the team make up a baseball card for every one of the hostages, and with their photo on it and the basic information about them. It was a pretty thick stack. And I kept that with me at all times. I kept my briefcase, I had it next to my bed at night. I wanted to look at those people every day when I got up, when I went to bed, and think, what have I done to try and bring one of them home that day? And we had we were very fortunate. We had a lot of success, and the president's leadership, we were able to bring a lot of people home while I was in that office. And in some cases, due to the tremendous bravery of intelligence operatives or armed forces, I still think of 2 French Marines who were killed rescuing 2 French, South Korean, and an American hostage who were taken by JNIM in the Sahel in West Africa. It was a tremendous operation, but it had to be done very quickly. And so the French did a high altitude, high opening parachute drop into a terrorist camp. They had just probably 2 or 3 or 4 fewer people than they needed to secure the structure. And what you have to do is, when you hit a terrorist camp that's holding hostages, you have to hit all the structures at once, because the SOP for the terrorist is to shoot the hostages first to deter future attempts to rescue them. And so you have to hit them hard. And when they landed, they had their plates, their bulletproof vest, parachuted down separately, because it's hard to do one of those parachutes if you're weighted, parachute jumps if you're weighted down by heavy plates. But they landed, they thought they'd been spotted, and so a number of the guys weren't able to put their Kevlar on or put their plates on. And unfortunately, the 2 guys that hit the tent that had the 4 hostages who were on the floor, they came through the door and they got in a gunfight with the terrorists. They eliminated the terrorists, saved the hostage's life, but they both took incoming rounds and weren't able to be saved. And so a lot of brave people were involved in various operations to bring these hostages home. But what was interesting about the job is you don't really focus on the hostages that you get home. And you get home, it's great. You might take them to the Oval Office of the President, you talk to their families. But I always, that was pretty fleeting. My thought always went to the remainder. The stack got thinner, and at least the one I started with, it's down to a much smaller number now. But until all those folks come home, and fortunately it's all men, there aren't any women hostages who were. There's one New Zealand nurse that's not one of ours, but that ISIS took, and things it doesn't look very good for her right now. But for the most part, they're men who are hostages. But until they get home, it's hard to take a lot of credit or feel good about the folks you brought home, when you know that there's still others who are out there and are waiting to get rescued or are waiting for some sort of negotiation to get them back.
Thank you. Let's close with a couple of questions from law students. Is your negotiation success in high stress and high stakes situations credited to your litigation experience?
I actually think it is. And I'll just give you one quick example. And you'll see this as lawyers and as judges and prosecutors as you go out into your fields. We get a lot more experience negotiating than our best diplomats do. Our best diplomats may take a course, they might be involved in 1 or 2 big negotiations, they may carry briefcases in and out with others, but they're not doing mediations, every week, and arbitrations every week, and phone calls with opposing counsel every week, or getting proffers from attorneys every week, or telling Nick, this is a terrible case, worst case I've ever seen, or Adam, you don't want to prosecute this one, you'll lose it. The amount of negotiations that we go through, or that Judge Bybee would oversee as a mediator when he's trying to mediate his cases, it's something that almost can't be replicated in training for diplomats or others. So I think that I think that my experience as a lawyer and a lawyer in private practice gave me a tremendous advantage. And give you one, I was negotiating with we had a big team. We were negotiating with a foreign country with the foreign minister across from me. And we thought we were very close to a deal. This is a major country, and we had like 10 people on our side, some very senior ambassadors on our side. They had 10 or 12 people on their side. And the foreign minister of this country started to get a little cute and was trying to walk back, and he was trying to look tougher to his leader, the drive a great deal. And we had the vice president flying in to sign the deal. And the foreign minister was backtracking on a bunch of things that we'd agreed to the night before. And I just, did something you've done it 1,000 times. You do it on auto accident case, soft tissue case or something. I just packed up my briefcase and said, hey, look, we gave it our best shot. Obviously, we weren't going to get a deal here. Thank you. Really appreciate your time. Thanks for the nice, snacks that you had out for us and the water. But the vice president's like 2 hours out. I've got to call him and make sure he turns his plane around so he can go somewhere else to refuel. I can't have a plan with no deal. Thought we had a deal. Apparently something changed. Totally understand. So I pack up my briefcase. And I get up to walk out, and the State Department folks on our side, including some guys who've been around the block, are kind of looking at me going, oh my gosh, this is serious. I'm getting up, and the foreign minister said, no, sit back down. And they sat down, and we got the thing worked out. The vice president landed, and we got the deal done. And afterwards, they pulled me aside and they said, gosh, you packed up your briefcase and you were like walking out of the negotiation. We've never seen anything like that before. I said, you gotta be kidding me. I mean, that's, one side or other has done that every mediation I've ever been in. A $10,000 case, So I do think there is some advantage that we all have as lawyers and judges and prosecutors, defense lawyers that some of the folks on the other side don't have, or some of our own diplomats don't have, and so there's there's definitely room for you if you want to go into diplomacy with your legal background, with your law school education, and your time in practice.
Thank you. Last question. What should a young law student who is interested in foreign policy as a career do to prepare themselves?
That's a good question, and look, just about every job I've had on this front has been, totally accidental, and